Guests were still eating when Terence pulled the chair from under Nadine and told her to sit on the floor where she belonged. His mistress, Crystal, took the empty seat and placed her hand on his thigh. "She's not even worth the plate," Crystal said, and two cousins laughed. Nadine's hip hit the tile hard, but she didn't cry. She adjusted the vintage watch on her wrist and glanced at the restaurant entrance. Because the woman walking in right now carried proof that Terence's perfect new life was built on a lie he could never explain. Stay with this one. Because what Nadine does next is something you won't see coming, and something you'll never forget. The restaurant was called Laurel and Vine, one of those upscale soul food places on the north side of the city where the lighting was warm and the tables were spaced far enough apart that people could pretend they weren't listening to each other. But tonight, in the private dining section booked for Terence's cousin's birthday, everybody was listening. 30 guests, white tablecloths, a jazz trio playing soft near the window, and Terence Mitchell sitting at the head of the table like a king who had already won. He had been loud all evening, ordering rounds of drinks he didn't need to pay for because his real estate business was booming, and he wanted every person in that room to know it. He leaned back in his chair with his arm draped behind Crystal Porter, a woman who was not his wife, and when the waitress brought the appetizers, Terence raised his glass. "I want to toast the woman who keeps me alive," he said. His eyes landed on Crystal, not on Nadine. Crystal smiled slow and deliberate, pressing her fingers into his thigh like she was marking territory. The room shifted. A few people looked down at their plates. One aunt cleared her throat. Nobody said a word. Nadine sat at the far end of the table, 3 seats from the center, wearing a simple navy dress and her father's vintage watch, the one he had placed in her hands the week before he died. She had been quiet all evening, not sulking, not crying, just watching. Watching the way Crystal leaned into Terence's ear. Watching the way Terence's mother, Francine, had greeted Crystal with a hug at the door, but only nodded at Nadine from across the room. Watching all of it with the kind of stillness that made people uncomfortable when they finally noticed it. Then Terence told her to move. He didn't ask. He pointed at her chair and said, Crystal needed more room. Nadine reached for her purse to stand, but she wasn't fast enough. Terence grabbed the back of the chair and yanked it sideways. Nadine's hip hit the tile floor hard enough to make the silverware rattle. Crystal slid into the empty seat without missing a beat. "She's not even worth the plate," Crystal said, and 2 of Terence's younger cousins laughed from across the table. Short, nervous laughs, the kind people make when they don't know what else to do. Nobody helped Nadine up. Not the aunt who had watched her grow up. Not the cousin who had borrowed money from her twice. Not the uncle who had called her the best thing to ever happen to this family. At the wedding, nobody. And that's silence, the kind that fills a room when everyone knows something wrong just happened, but no one wants to be the first to say it. That silence was louder than anything Terence had said all night. But Nadine didn't cry. She pressed her palm flat against the cool tile and pushed herself up slowly, like a woman who had already decided that this floor was the last floor she would ever be put on. She straightened her dress. She adjusted the vintage watch on her wrist, the gold face catching the overhead light for just a moment. And then she looked toward the restaurant entrance. A woman had just walked in, tall, professional, carrying a manila envelope pressed tight against her side. She scanned the room until she found Nadine's eyes, and something passed between them. Not a word, not a gesture, just a single, quiet nod. The kind of nod that means everything is ready. Terence didn't notice. He was too busy laughing at his own joke, too busy letting Crystal refill his glass, too busy being the man he thought he was. But the room had already changed, because the woman standing near the hostess stand right now held something in that envelope that would turn this dinner into the last good night Terence Mitchell would ever have. They met 5 years ago at a community fundraiser for a youth mentoring program on the South Side. Terence was charming then, the kind of charming that didn't feel rehearsed. He wore a fitted blazer and laughed with his whole body, and when he found out Nadine was an accountant, he told her she was the most interesting person he'd talked to all night. She didn't believe him, but she liked the way he looked at her, like she was the only woman in the room who mattered. Her father had just passed 3 months earlier. Lung cancer. Quick and cruel. He'd left Nadine a life insurance payout and a vintage gold watch that he'd worn every day of her life since she was old enough to remember. The week before, he died. While she was sitting beside his hospital bed holding his hand, he had unclasped the watch from his own wrist and pressed it into her palm. "When the time is right," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "you'll know what you're worth." She didn't understand what he meant then. She wore the watch every day anyway, because wearing it made her feel like he was still walking beside her. Terence proposed after 8 months. They married in a small ceremony at a botanical garden with white chairs and string lights and 60 guests who all said the same thing, that Nadine deserved this kind of happiness after everything she'd been through. She used a portion of her father's life insurance to put the down payment on a house, a 3-bedroom brick colonial on a quiet street with a magnolia tree in the front yard. She signed the papers. Both their names went on the deed. It felt like the beginning of something permanent. The first 2 years were good. Terence was building his real estate company from the ground up, and Nadine handled the books, balanced their personal accounts, and made sure every dollar had a purpose. They were a team. Sunday dinners with his mother, Francine, became a ritual. Francine would call Nadine baby and brag to her church friends about her daughter-in-law's sharp mind. Nadine believed every word. But sometime around the 3rd year, things began to shift in small ways that didn't announce themselves. Terence started staying out later. His phone buzzed at odd hours, and he'd take the call in another room with the door closed. He bought clothes Nadine hadn't seen him try on and drove to parts of the city she hadn't heard him mention. When she asked, he waved her off with a smile that had an edge to it. "Business meetings, Nadine. You wouldn't understand." She found a woman's earring in his coat pocket, a small gold hoop that didn't belong to her. He said it must have come from a colleague at an open house. She found a second phone charger plugged in behind the passenger seat of his car. He said it was a spare. She found a receipt from a jewelry store for a pendant, $1,400, and when she asked about it, he told her it was a gift for his mother. Francine never wore a pendant. Nadine checked. Then one evening, while reviewing their joint bank statements, because that was what Nadine did, that was how her mind was built, she noticed a transfer she hadn't authorized. $12,000 moved from their joint savings into an account she didn't recognize. She traced it quietly through the routing number. The account was registered under the name T&C Holdings. She didn't know what the C stood for. Not yet. And there was something else. something she almost missed because it was tucked inside a folder on Terrence's desk at home labeled simply Property. She opened it late one night while he was out. It was a title transfer for their house. The house her father's life insurance had paid for moved entirely into Terrence's name. No cosigner, no notarized consent from Nadine. Just his signature and a date from 4 months ago. She photographed every page. Then she put the folder back exactly where she found it, closed the office door, and sat in the dark kitchen for a very long time. She didn't confront him. She didn't call anyone. She didn't cry. She just sat there with her father's watch ticking softly on her wrist, each second steady and patient, and she thought about what kind of woman she was going to be next. The discovery didn't come all at once. It came in layers, each one worse than the last, like pulling bandages off a wound that kept getting deeper the more you uncovered it. 3 weeks after finding the title transfer, Nadine stayed late at her own accounting office and pulled the full records for T&C Holdings, using public business filings anyone could access. The registered partners were Terrence Mitchell and Crystal Porter. The account had been active for 14 months. Monthly deposits of $3,000 to $5,000 were flowing in from Terrence's real estate company. Money that should have been hitting their household account, money Nadine had budgeted for mortgage payments and retirement savings, and the emergency fund she'd been building since her father died. Their joint savings, which Nadine had built over 4 years of disciplined budgeting, was nearly empty. $47,000 had been redirected. Crystal's name was on every single withdrawal. That was the first wound, the money, the slow, deliberate theft of a future that Nadine had assembled dollar by dollar, while Terrence smiled in her face every morning over breakfast. But the second wound cut deeper than money ever could. Nadine had always been careful with technology, and she knew Terrence's email password because he had given it to her years ago when they shared everything. She hadn't used it in over a year. She didn't want to be that kind of wife, the kind who checks and worries and loses sleep. But that night, sitting alone in her office with the lights off and her coffee gone cold beside the keyboard, she opened his account and typed Crystal's name into the search bar. The emails were bad enough. Plans for weekend trips Nadine never knew about. Pet names that made her stomach tighten, photos she closed immediately and didn't open again. But it wasn't the emails between Terrence and Crystal that cracked something open inside Nadine's chest that night. It was the thread between Terrence and his mother, Francine. The woman Nadine had nursed through a hip replacement surgery 2 years ago. Sleeping on a cot beside her hospital bed for 4 nights, spooning broth into her mouth, driving her to physical therapy 3 times a week for 2 months. The woman she had cooked Sunday dinners for every single week without complaint. The woman who called her baby and held her face in both hands and told her she was the daughter she'd always wanted. That woman had been advising her son on how to push Nadine out of the marriage cleanly for over a year. The messages were precise, calculated. Francine had written, "She's dead weight, baby. Crystal knows how to move in your world. Crystal understands ambition." And later, "Transfer the house now before she gets wise. A woman like Nadine will start asking questions soon." And the worst one, sent just 2 weeks before the restaurant dinner. "Once the house is in your name, she's got nothing. Let her crawl back to her mother." Nadine read that last line 3 times. Then she closed the laptop slowly, pressed both hands flat on her desk and sat perfectly still. Her father's watch caught the faint glow of the streetlight coming through the office window. She could hear it ticking in the silence, steady, patient, like it had been waiting for this exact moment. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she hadn't used in 2 years. It rang twice. "I need to meet with you," Nadine said. Her voice was flat and controlled. "I have the documents." The voice on the other end didn't ask who, didn't ask why, just asked one word. When? Soon. Over the next 3 weeks, Nadine moved with the kind of quiet precision that most people never see coming because they're too busy watching for noise. She met with a real estate attorney named Dwight Abrams on a Tuesday afternoon while Terrence was across town showing a property to investors. She brought the photographs of the title transfer, the original deed with both their names printed clearly, and a certified copy of her father's life insurance disbursement showing that the entire down payment had come from her personal inheritance. Dwight studied the documents for 20 minutes without speaking. Then he leaned back in his chair, removed his glasses, and said, "He forged this transfer. There's no notarized consent from you anywhere in these papers. This is textbook real estate fraud." Nadine didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. She just asked, "What can we do about it?" Dwight filed a quiet lien on the property within the week, a legal hold that wouldn't show up on a casual search, but would surface the instant Terrence tried to sell, refinance, or transfer the house to anyone else. The house was frozen. Terrence just didn't know it yet. Meanwhile, Nadine spent her evenings copying every financial record she could get her hands on. Bank statements going back 2 years, wire transfer confirmations, the T&C Holdings business filings with Crystal's name printed next to Terrence's, deposit receipts, withdrawal histories, and Francine's messages, every single one, screenshotted with timestamps, saved to a folder on her desktop labeled Taxes 2024, because she knew Terrence would never open a file with that name. She backed everything onto an encrypted flash drive and locked it in a safety deposit box at a bank across town. A bank Terrence didn't know about, an account he couldn't touch. Then she handed a second copy of everything to the woman she had called that night. Her name was Olivia Hammond. They had been roommates at Howard University back when Nadine was studying accounting and Olivia was on the forensic finance track. Olivia was now a certified forensic accountant who worked with law firms on fraud and embezzlement cases. She was meticulous. She was thorough. And when Nadine had called her after 2 years of silence, Olivia hadn't asked a single unnecessary question. She just said, "When?" and showed up. Olivia reviewed the entire file over 3 evenings at her apartment. Spreadsheets, bank records, screenshots. She cross-referenced every transfer, verified every timestamp, and built a clean, court-admissible paper trail. When she was finished, she called Nadine and said, "This is airtight. Every dollar is accounted for. When you're ready, this will hold up anywhere, in a courtroom, in front of a mediator, or in front of 30 people at a dinner table." Nadine thanked her quietly and said, "I'll let you know when." And while Nadine was building her case in silence, Terrence was building his confidence in volume. He bought Crystal a new car, a pearl-white SUV with tinted windows that Crystal drove to Terrence's office like she was arriving at a company she co-owned. He brought Crystal to family barbecues, to church events, to business dinners, where clients shook her hand and assumed she was his wife. Francine treated Crystal like a daughter she had chosen, introducing her to relatives, sitting beside her at family gatherings, posting photos of the two of them on social media with captions like, "My girl," and a heart emoji. And Crystal, emboldened by all of it, started posting photos from inside the house, Nadine's house. The house Nadine's dying father had unknowingly paid for with the last financial gift he would ever give. Crystal stood in the kitchen Nadine had picked the tile for and posted a photo with the caption, "Home Sweet Home." She sat on the couch Nadine had chosen and posted a selfie. She tagged Terrence in all of it. Francine liked every single post. Nadine saw all of it, every photo, every tag, every comment. She didn't react, she didn't unfollow, she didn't block anyone. She just saved the posts quietly, added them to the file, and kept moving. Then the invitation arrived. Terrence's cousin's birthday dinner at Laurel and Vine, a private dining section, 30 guests. Terrence told Nadine she was expected to attend, said it casually over breakfast, like he was reminding her to pick up milk. Then he added without looking up from his phone, "Don't embarrass me, just sit there and be quiet." Nadine RSVP'd the same afternoon. She picked her outfit carefully, a simple navy dress, clean lines, nothing flashy. She pressed it the night before. She laid it on the bed beside her shoes. And on the morning of the dinner, she stood in front of the bathroom mirror and clasped her father's vintage watch onto her wrist. The gold face caught the bathroom light. She looked at herself for a long time, not with sadness, not with anger, but with the calm certainty of a woman who knows exactly what she is about to do. Then she picked up her phone and texted Olivia one word: "Tonight." The restaurant hummed with the low music of conversation and the soft clink of glassware. After the fall, after Terrence yanked the chair and Nadine's body hit the tile, the energy in the private dining section had shifted like weather turning. But most people were trying to pretend it hadn't. Forks moved again, voices came back. Terrence ordered another bottle of wine, pulled Crystal closer, and carried on like nothing had happened, because to him, nothing had. But Nadine was standing now. She had risen from that cold floor with no help from a single person in the room, and she didn't go back to the table. She walked to the bar at the edge of the dining section, sat on a stool with her back straight, and ordered a glass of water. Not wine, not a cocktail, water. And she sipped it slowly, like a woman who had nowhere else to be and nothing left to prove to anyone in that room. Terrence's Aunt Beverly leaned toward the woman beside her and whispered, "Why isn't she crying?" The question moved through the section like a draft through an open window. People heard it even if they pretended they didn't, and the truth was, nobody in that room could figure it out. A woman gets pulled from her seat by her own husband in front of 30 people, lands on the floor in front of his mistress, and she doesn't cry, doesn't shout, doesn't storm out. She just orders a glass of water and sits at the bar like she's waiting for a table at a different restaurant. Crystal noticed, too. She leaned into Terrence's ear and whispered loud enough for the nearest guests to catch it. "See? She doesn't even care. She's empty inside. I told you she was nothing." Terrence laughed, but the laugh came out shorter this time, clipped at the edges. Something was scratching at the back of his mind. Not guilt. Terrence didn't have the architecture for guilt, but something. The way Nadine had looked at the door when she stood up, the way her hand had gone straight to that old watch on her wrist, like it meant something, like she was checking the time for a reason. Then there was the woman, the one who had walked in carrying the manila envelope. She was sitting at a small table near the back of the section now, alone, working through a Caesar salad with the composed patience of someone who had been in rooms like this before and knew exactly when to wait. Dark blazer, hair pinned up, reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She didn't look at Terence. She didn't look at Crystal. She looked at her food. And occasionally, without lifting her head, she looked at Nadine. And every time she did, something in the room pulled tighter. Terence noticed her. He squinted across the section and asked Crystal, "Who is that?" Crystal glanced over and shrugged. Probably someone's +1. But Terence kept looking. There was something about the silent rhythm between his wife and this woman. The way neither of them looked anxious, the way they seemed to be breathing on the same clock, that made the back of his neck warm. Then Francine arrived. Late, as always, coat draped over one arm and chin tilted up like she was walking into her own living room. She crossed the dining section, walked straight past Nadine without a glance, and kissed Crystal on the cheek. "You look gorgeous in that dress, baby," she said. Then she sat beside Crystal, patted her hand, and asked what she was drinking. Nadine watched this from the bar. Her expression didn't change. She sipped her water. She touched the glass face of her father's watch. And she waited, because now all the people who needed to be in this room were in this room. Something was building. The guests could feel it, even if they couldn't name it. A pressure behind the laughter and the small talk and the clinking of dessert forks that had nothing to do with the birthday celebration. It was coming from Nadine, from the quiet center of the room where she sat perfectly still, from the calm that had stopped looking like weakness and was starting to look like something else entirely. One of the younger cousins, the same one who had laughed when Nadine hit the floor, leaned over to his date and whispered, "She looks like she's waiting for something." He had no idea how right he was. Dessert had been served, a 3-layer chocolate cake with edible gold leaf that Terence had special ordered because nothing about this night was supposed to be ordinary. The jazz trio had packed their instruments and gone quiet. Conversations had thinned into the low, scattered murmur of people finishing their last glass of wine and reaching for their coats. And Terence, who had never met a silence he didn't want to fill with his own voice, pushed back his chair and stood. "One more toast," he said, lifting his champagne glass. He looked around the room, smiled wide, and landed his gaze on Crystal. "To my future." Crystal smiled. Francine raised her glass with both hands. A few guests lifted theirs halfway, more out of obligation than celebration. But before the glass reached his lips, Nadine stood. She didn't shove her chair. She didn't make a scene. She simply rose from the bar stool, straightened the hem of her navy dress, and turned to face the room with her hands at her sides. The movement was so quiet, so unhurried, so deliberate that it silenced the dining section faster than anything Terence had said all night. It was the kind of silence that happens when a room realizes it has been watching the wrong person. 30 pairs of eyes turned toward the woman who had been pulled to the floor an hour ago and hadn't spoken a single word since. Nadine looked past Terence, past Crystal, past Francine. She looked at the woman sitting at the back table and said one word. "Olivia." Olivia Hammond stood. She set down her napkin, picked up the manila envelope, and walked to the center of the dining section with the measured calm of a woman who had done this in courtrooms and conference rooms and boardrooms before. She placed the envelope on the table directly in front of Terence and opened it without ceremony. One by one, she laid out the documents on the white tablecloth between the champagne flutes and the dessert plates. Bank statements for T&C Holdings, the joint account between Terence and Crystal, funded with money siphoned from the household savings Nadine had spent 4 years building. Wire transfer records showing 14 months of systematic withdrawals. Deposit confirmations with Crystal's name on every single one. And at the bottom of the stack, placed last, because Olivia understood the power of sequence, the title transfer for the house. The house Nadine's father's life insurance had paid for, moved into Terence's name alone. No notarized signature from Nadine, no cosigner. Just Terence's handwriting and a forged date. Terence's champagne glass was still in the air. His mouth hung open, but nothing came out. Crystal's smile had vanished like it had been slapped off her face. Her hand, the one that had been resting on Terence's thigh all night like she owned him, dropped into her own lap. She stared at the documents spread across the table, and her jaw tightened. Nadine spoke. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't step forward. She didn't point or gesture or tremble. She stood exactly where she was, her hands still at her sides, and she spoke with the kind of calm that makes the air in a room feel heavier. That house was bought with my father's life insurance. Every dollar of the down payment came from a man who worked 41 years and died before he could enjoy a single day of retirement. You took his money and moved it into her name. You drained our savings into an account I never knew existed, and you didn't do it alone. She turned slowly to Francine. I have the messages, Francine, every single one, including the one where you called me dead weight, including the one where you told your son to transfer the house before I got wise, and including the one you sent 2 weeks ago, the one where you wrote, and these are your exact words, let her crawl back to her mother. Francine's face drained of color like someone had pulled a plug. Her lips parted, but no sound came through. Her hand found the edge of the tablecloth and gripped it so tightly the fabric bunched between her fingers. She looked at Terence. Terence didn't look back. The room was frozen. Not a fork moved. Not a glass clinked. Not a throat cleared. The server, who had been approaching with a tray of coffee cups, stopped dead in the middle of the aisle and stood there holding the tray, not knowing whether to go forward or retreat. The 2 cousins who had laughed when Nadine hit the floor were staring at their empty plates like the answers to everything were written in the dessert residue. Aunt Beverly had one hand pressed over her mouth, and her eyes were wide and wet. 30 people held their breath at the same time, and the only sound in that entire restaurant was the distant hum of the kitchen behind the swinging doors. Nadine lifted her wrist. The vintage gold watch caught the overhead light, the same warm glow it had carried on her father's wrist for decades. She looked at it for a quiet moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer, almost tender. My father gave me this watch the week before he died, he said. When the time is right, you'll know what you're worth. She paused. Let the words settle. I didn't understand what he meant then. I understand now. Crystal broke first. She turned to Terence, her voice cracking at the edges like plaster before the wall falls. Baby, tell them it's not true. Tell them she's lying. But Terence didn't look at her. His eyes were locked on the documents, on the bank statements, on the transfer records, on the title page that was supposed to stay buried in the bottom drawer of his home office until the day Nadine was gone for good. He set the champagne glass down slowly, and then he took a step back, not toward Crystal, away from her, away from the table, away from the woman he had paraded in front of everyone all night. Like she was a fire he had just realized he was standing too close to. Crystal saw it happen in real time. The man who had pulled a chair from under his wife for her, the man who had toasted her in front of 30 guests, the man who had let her post photos from his wife's kitchen. That man was backing away. Her face changed. The arrogance that had been there all night, the smirks, the touches, the whispered insults, the blown kiss, dissolved so fast it was like watching someone age 10 years in 10 seconds. She looked around the table for a single ally, and every person at that table looked away from her. Nobody spoke. 10 full seconds of silence, the longest, heaviest silence that restaurant had ever held. Olivia gathered the documents back into the envelope with the same calm she had laid them out with. She stepped to the side, tucked the envelope under her arm, and said nothing. She didn't need to. The numbers had spoken. The paper trail was clean. 14 months of fraud, laid bare under warm restaurant lights between champagne flutes and chocolate cake. Nadine looked at Terence one last time. She didn't curse at him. She didn't threaten. She didn't beg for an explanation she already had. She looked at him the way you look at a door you've already decided to close. Without anger, without sadness, just with the quiet finality of someone who is done. Then she picked up her purse, touched the watch on her wrist, and walked toward the exit. She passed the table where Francine sat frozen. She passed the cousins who had laughed. She passed the aunt who hadn't helped her up from the floor. Not one of them could look at her, and Nadine didn't need them to. She pushed through the front doors of Laurel and Vine and stepped into the night air. And the last thing anyone in that room saw was the back of her navy dress disappearing through the doorway, like she had already forgotten every single one of them. She didn't look back, not once. The collapse didn't happen in a single dramatic moment. It happened the way most collapses happen, slowly at first, and then all at once, like a building that's been rotting from the inside for years, and finally gives way when someone opens the wrong door. Within 48 hours of the dinner at Laurel and Vine, 3 of Terence's real estate investment partners pulled their commitments. These were men who had been sitting at that table, men who had watched the documents land on the white tablecloth like grenades and had seen Terence's face go blank. One of them left a voicemail. "We're going in a different direction, Terence. I wish you well." A second one sent a text. "I can't have my name next to yours right now. You understand." The third didn't call at all. He had his attorney send a certified letter terminating their partnership agreement. The lien on the house surfaced 5 days later when Terence, in a panic, tried to refinance the property to free up cash. His own real estate attorney sat him down and explained what Nadine's lawyer had done. The title transfer was fraudulent. Nadine's name had never been removed through proper legal channels. The original down payment was fully traceable to her father's life insurance payout. The lien was airtight. Terence sat in that office for 40 minutes without speaking. When he stood up, his legs looked unsteady beneath him, like a man trying to walk on ground that had already cracked open. Crystal moved out of the house within a week. She packed 2 suitcases and a garment bag, while Terrence was at his office trying to hold meetings with people who no longer returned his calls. She tried to reach him 14 times that first day. By the 3rd day, he had blocked her number. By the 5th, Crystal posted a vague, artful photo on social media. A sunset, a candle, a caption about releasing toxic energy and choosing peace. Not a single person responded. No likes, no comments, no emoji reactions. Nothing. The silence followed her the same way it had followed Nadine across that restaurant floor, except nobody was pulling out a chair for Crystal. Nobody was offering her a seat. Francine tried next. She called Terrence twice. He let both calls ring out. She left a voicemail that started strong and crumbled halfway through. Something about loyalty and family, and how Nadine had always been too sensitive. He deleted it without listening to the end. Then Francine did something she never thought she'd have to do. She called Nadine. Nadine picked up on the 2nd ring. "You didn't have to do that in front of everyone," Francine said. Her voice was tight, controlled, not a trace of apology in it. Nadine was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You didn't have to text your son to steal from me, but here we are." And she hung up. Clean. Final. The kind of hang-up that doesn't leave room for a callback. 2 weeks later, Terrence showed up at Nadine's office. He didn't knock. He pushed through the door and stood in the reception area with his jaw clenched and his fists at his sides. He wasn't there to apologize. He was there because he still believed he could intimidate the woman who had watched him from the floor of a restaurant and chosen not to flinch. "You think you can embarrass me and just walk away?" he said. Nadine looked up from her desk. She studied him for a long, unhurried moment, the same way she had studied him from the tile floor at Laurel and Vine, with that same calm, that same stillness, that same absolute refusal to give him what he wanted. "I already walked away, Terrence," she said. "You just didn't notice." He stood there for another 10 seconds, waiting for tears, waiting for anger, waiting for the version of Nadine he had built in his head, the one who would eventually break, eventually beg, eventually crawl back. But that woman didn't exist anymore. Maybe she never had. He turned and left. The door closed softly behind him, which was somehow worse than a slam, because it meant even his anger didn't have enough weight to fill the room. The divorce was filed within the month. Nadine's attorney presented the complete financial record, the fraudulent title, the T&C Holdings account, the drained savings, and Francine's text messages. Terrence's lawyer reviewed everything, sat with his client for less than an hour, and advised him not to contest it. The settlement returned the house to Nadine's name, recovered a significant portion of the redirected funds, and dissolved the marriage with the kind of clean, surgical precision that only happens when one side has been preparing, while the other side was too busy celebrating. On the day the final papers were signed, Terrence sat alone in his car in the courthouse parking lot. Engine off, windows up, hands on the steering wheel. He didn't drive anywhere. He just sat there in a suit that used to make him feel like the most important man in any room. It didn't feel like anything anymore. 6 months later, Nadine sold the house. She didn't need it anymore. Not because of what it represented. She had made her peace with that. But because it belonged to a chapter of her life that was finished. and she had never been the kind of woman who reread chapters she had already understood. She took the equity and bought a smaller place on a quiet street in a neighborhood she had always admired from a distance. A cottage-style home with a wraparound porch and a backyard garden that caught full morning sun. The day she moved in, she stood in the empty living room and listened to the silence. It was a different kind of silence than the one at the restaurant. This one didn't have weight, it had space. She planted tomatoes and basil along the back fence. She put in a row of marigolds, the stubborn kind, the ones that bloom gold and refuse to quit even when the season starts to turn. She hung wind chimes from the porch beam that caught the breeze on Sunday mornings and made a sound like someone laughing very softly from very far away. She kept her accounting firm. She took on 3 new clients that spring and hired a part-time assistant for the first time. She started waking up early again, not because she couldn't sleep, but because she wanted to see the sun come up over her own garden, her own fence, her own quiet street. Some mornings she made breakfast with the back door open and let the breeze come through, and she realized she had forgotten what it felt like to eat a meal without tension sitting across the table from her. On a Sunday morning in late October, Nadine sat on the back porch with a cup of coffee resting on the wooden railing beside her. The air had that clean October bite to it, cool enough for a light sweater, warm enough to sit outside with bare feet on the wood. The marigolds were still holding on, gold and defiant against the first brown edges of autumn. A cardinal landed on the fence post, tilted its red head at her like it had something to say, held her gaze for a moment, and flew off again toward the tree line. Her phone buzzed on the table beside her. A text from Olivia. "Still on for brunch?" Nadine smiled, a real smile, the kind that starts somewhere deep in the chest before it reaches the face, and typed back one word: "Always." She set the phone down. She didn't check Terrence's name. She didn't wonder where Crystal had ended up or whether she had found someone else to post photos from. She didn't think about Francine or the restaurant floor or the sound of 2 cousins laughing while her hip met cold tile. She had carried all of that for long enough, carried it the way women carry things they never asked for, quietly, with their backs straight and their jaws tight. But she had set it down now. Set it down the way you set down a bag that was never yours to carry in the first place, and it had stayed exactly where she left it. She looked at the watch on her wrist, her father's watch. The gold face caught the morning light the way it always had. Warm, steady, patient, like a man who had worked 41 years and never once complained about the weight of it. She pressed her thumb against the glass and held it there for a quiet moment, the way she used to hold his hand when she was small enough for his palm to cover hers entirely. The garden stretched out before her, full of things she had planted with her own 2 hands. The wind chimes turned slowly in the breeze. The coffee was still warm. And Nadine sat there, white linen blouse, bare feet on the sun-warmed porch, morning light moving through the garden like it had nowhere better to be, with her father's watch glowing gold on her wrist, the only inheritance that had ever truly mattered. She didn't need revenge. She didn't need to scream. The people who tried to break her had already made themselves smaller the moment she refused to break with them. All Nadine had needed was the truth, the right timing, and the patience her father placed in her hands the day he gave her that watch. She rested her fingers over the gold face and closed her eyes for a moment. And for the first time in years, she did not feel abandoned. She felt accompanied, as if her father had been beside her through every silence, every insult, every second she chose dignity over despair. Some wounds do not heal because time passes. They heal when the people who caused them lose the power to define what happened. The breeze moved through the marigolds, the wind chimes answered, and in that quiet porch light, Nadine understood what her father had meant all along. When the time is right, you'll know what you're worth. A tear slipped free, but she smiled, because she knew now. She had never crawled back to anyone. Not that night, not ever. She had risen,